Hello and welcome to the next episode in the Deep Rising Introductory Training series. And in this video, we're going to be looking at viscosity. Viscosity is a solver force, specifically the euphoric solver. So to find it, you go to the solvers tab, and under euphoric, you go to forces, and it's the first force out of one of the four forces that are available for euphoric. Now, there's two types of viscosity. There's normal viscosity, which I'll discuss briefly, and boundary viscosity. So it's the same concept but applied to two different things. So viscosity can be viewed as friction between a continuous medium. For things like smoke, water that are continuous, it's friction, internal friction, it's internal force. And the easiest way to think about it without going into the details is it's friction between particles. But to note, the velocity dampening in deep rising also behaves a little bit like friction because it slows down forces, but it's not physically accurate. Okay, so this viscosity is closer to being physically accurate, but it's not completely physically accurate. Okay, so it's also a low type of viscosity. So you'll be able to simulate things like syrup, honey, and chocolate, for example. But if you want higher viscous things where you pour and it retains its shape, for example, like lava, for example, that becomes hard, you need something called high viscosity, which the Prasima solver actually does. It's dedicated to high viscosity, but deep rising only handles low viscosity, which is very important to remember. Okay, in this video, I'm just mainly going to go through examples that I've already compiled because they take time to simulate. So I'm just going to go through these. So the scene that I'll be going through is very simple. And if you've looked through the old videos, it's very simple to set up. The thing, I've also included an infinite plane, which you can see, which catches the particles at the bottom. So it's just a sphere triangulated, and a emitter which I've just positioned. It's got a strength of 3. And of course, the substeps are 15. Yeah, so besides that, everything else is on the default settings, and here you will see the viscosity settings as I go through these videos. Okay, let me just play this. So this is by default, the viscosity is this value here. There is no boundary viscosity. And what you see is just the particles flying off, pretty much like water just hitting off an object. So if you want to simulate water effects of viscous water just pouring on stuff with little resistance, the default viscosity is good. Now, switching off viscosity also is not always a good idea. This type of simulations want a little bit of viscosity to be stable because, like I said in the earlier videos, they preserve energy really well. So in order to tame that a bit, you need viscosity. So by default, you have a 0.01. It helps the simulation and you get this type of effect. Okay, moving on to the next video. Okay, and in this video, I've increased the viscosity to 0.01, and you will see there's immediately an effect. It looks different. As you can see, the particles are beginning to resist the flow, and they're getting these long tendrils. And if you look at the bottom, so it's forming different types of patterns. Okay? Yeah, that's the effect of the viscosity between particles. So the surface, which is actually the boundary particles that are on the surface, don't have any viscosity, and we'll get into that later. Okay, moving on. Okay, and viscosity at 0.5. Now this is probably the highest you can go with viscosity. After 0.5, you won't see any differences in viscosity. And it's advised not to go above 0.5 unless you've got other forces acting against the viscosity that are stronger than the actual viscosity. So you might go to 1. But generally, if there's no other forces acting against it, you stick to 0.5 and below. If you go above, it's not guaranteed the simulation will remain stable. You might see some popping effects, some exploding, and high velocity particles. Okay. And the reason for that is if you want to handle true viscosity, it's about divergence. There's this thing called divergence in mathematics. You need everything to be divergence free, which this type of simulation here is not divergence free. You can make the euphoric solver divergence free, but it's going to take longer, and that's a topic for another video. But this type of viscosity actually won't respect that type of divergence, so it's recommended to stay 0.5 and below. Okay, next up we'll look at boundary viscosity. Okay, in this video I've dropped the viscosity back to 0.01 and the boundary viscosity to the same number, but you can already see it's different. The particles are actually now resisting and sliding down the surface, you see? And the smooth flow we were having before without the boundary viscosity, with the viscosity at 0.01, is gone now. Yeah, you can see that. Okay. And moving on to the next video. Okay, so this is viscosity at 0.01. Now you can see the particles appear to be sticking to the surface, which is not true. What's actually happening here is the friction is really high. Now, when particles stick to the surface, that's called adhesion. This is not adhesion, this is just a really high friction value. So the particles, the energy in the particles is dissipating really fast. So it looks like they're sticking to the surface, but they're not really sticking to the surface for this. Okay, so we've actually got a force in light wave just dedicated to this. It's called adhesion. It's right here. So this one's actually what's sticking. If you want particles to stick to surfaces specifically, this is it, and they don't lose energy. Okay, but with this one, it appears to they stick. It's just that there's friction and they're losing energy on the surface. Okay, you can actually choose between which one you prefer or which effect you want. Okay. And then for the final video, I'm just going to show normal viscosity and boundary viscosity. Of course, you can mix these values. They don't have to be the same. And viscosity can be different and boundary can be different. But here you can see now when both values at the maximum or recommended maximum, you get this very viscous material. Really slow pouring. So this would look good on if you're doing something like chocolate or honey, for example. Okay, and yeah, that's viscosity pretty much. That's the basics of viscosity. It's a very cool force. You can do, as you can see, just by changing the values, you can get very different looks from the fluids. Okay, and if you want to see what they look like, meshed, for example, for the last video I showed you, this is what the mesh looks like. Okay, like, you know, like very viscousy. You can see the tendrils is dripping down, which is really cool, I think. So yeah, and that's how you would do something like that. Okay, yeah, so that was viscosity. Thank you for watching, and see you in the next video.